Chapter 1, Part 4 of The Influence of Sea Power upon History, 1660 to 1783, by Alfred Thayer Mahan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The latter part of Louis's life thus witnessed that power failing by the weakening of its foundations, of commerce, and of the wealth that commerce brings. The government that followed, likewise absolute, of set purpose, and at the demand of England, gave up all pretence of maintaining an effective navy. The reason for this was that the new king was a minor, and the regent, being bitterly at enmity with the King of Spain, to injure him and preserve his own power, entered into alliance with England. He aided her to establish Austria, the hereditary enemy of France, in Naples and Sicily, to the detriment of Spain, and in union with her destroyed the Spanish navy and dockyards. Here again is found a personal ruler disregarding the sea interests of France, ruining a natural ally, and directly aiding, as Louis XIV. Indirectly and unintentionally aided, the growth of a mistress of the seas. This transient phase of policy passed away with the death of the regent in 1726, but from that time until 1760 the government of France continued to disregard her maritime interests. It is said, indeed, that owing to some wise modifications of her fiscal regulations, mainly in the direction of free trade, and due to Law, a minister of Scotch birth, commerce with the East and West Indies wonderfully increased, and that the islands of Guadeloupe and Martinique became very rich and thriving. But both commerce and colonies lay at the mercy of England when war came, for the navy fell into decay. In 1756, when things were no longer at their worst, France had but 45 ships of the line, England nearly 130, and when the 45 were to be armed and equipped, there was found to be neither material nor rigging nor supplies, not even enough artillery. Nor was this all. Lack of system in the government, says a French writer, brought about indifference and opened the door to disorder and lack of discipline. Never had unjust promotions been so frequent, so also never had more universal discontent been seen. Money and intrigue took the place of all else, and brought in their train commands and power. Nobles and upstarts, with influence at the capital and self-sufficiency in the seaports, thought themselves dispensed with merit. Waste of the revenues of the state and of the dockyards knew no bounds. Honor and modesty were turned into ridicule. As if the evils were not thus great enough, the ministry took pains to efface the heroic traditions of the past, which had escaped the general wreck. To the energetic fights of the great reign succeeded, by order of the court, affairs of circumspection. To preserve to the wasted material a few armed ships, increased opportunity was given to the enemy. From this unhappy principle we were bound to a defensive, as advantageous to the enemy as it was foreign to the genius of our people. This circumspection before the enemy, laid down for us by orders, betrayed in the long run the national temper, and the abuse of the system led to acts of indiscipline and defection under fire, of which a single instance would vainly be sought in the previous century. A false policy of continental extension swallowed up the resources of the country, and was doubly injurious because, by leaving defenseless its colonies and commerce, it exposed the greatest source of wealth to be cut off, as in fact happened. The small squadrons that got to sea were destroyed by vastly superior force. The merchant shipping was swept away, and the colonies, Canada, Martinique, Guadeloupe, India, fell into England's hands. If it did not take too much space, interesting extracts might be made, showing the woeful misery of France, the country that had abandoned the sea, and the growing wealth of England amid all her sacrifices and exertions. A contemporary writer has thus expressed his view of the policy of France at this period: France, by engaging so heartily as she has done in the German war, has drawn away so much of her attention and her revenue from her navy that it enabled us to give such a blow to her maritime strength as possibly she may never be able to recover. Her engagement in the German war has likewise drawn her from the defense of her colonies, by which means we have conquered some of the most considerable she possessed. It has withdrawn her from the protection of her trade, by which it is entirely destroyed, while that of England has never, in the profoundest peace, been in so flourishing a condition. So that by embarking in this German war, France has suffered herself to be undone, so far as regards her particular and immediate quarrel with England. In the 7 Years' War, France lost 37 ships of the line and 56 frigates, a force 3 times as numerous as the whole navy of the United States at any time in the days of sailing ships. For the first time since the Middle Ages, says a French historian, speaking of the same war, England had conquered France single-handed, almost without allies, France having powerful auxiliaries. She had conquered solely by the superiority of her government. Yes, but it was by the superiority of her government using the tremendous weapon of her sea power, the reward of a consistent policy perseveringly directed to one aim. The profound humiliation of France, which reached its depths between 1760 and 1763, at which latter date she made peace, has an instructive lesson for the United States, in this our period of commercial and naval decadence. We have been spared her humiliation; let us hope to profit by her subsequent example. Between the same years, 1760 and 1763, the French people rose, as afterward in 1793, and declared they would have a navy. Popular feeling, skilfully directed by the government, took up the cry from one end of France to the other: the navy must be restored. Gifts of ships were made by cities, by corporations, and by private subscriptions. A prodigious activity sprang up in the lately silent ports. Everywhere ships were building or repairing. This activity was sustained, the arsenals were replenished, the material of every kind was put on a satisfactory footing, the artillery reorganized, and 10,000 trained gunners drilled and maintained. The tone and action of the naval officers of the day instantly felt the popular impulse, for which indeed some loftier spirits among them had been not only waiting but working. At no time was greater mental and professional activity found among French naval officers than just then, when their ships had been suffered to rot away by governmental inaction. Thus a prominent French officer of our own day writes: "The sad condition of the navy in the reign of Louis XV, by closing to officers the brilliant career of bold enterprises and successful battles, forced them to fall back upon themselves. They drew from study the knowledge they were to put to the proof some years later, thus putting into practice that fine saying of Montesquieu, 'Adversity is our mother, prosperity our stepmother.' By the year 1769 was seen in all its splendor that brilliant galaxy of officers, whose activities stretched to the ends of the earth, and who embraced in their works and in their investigations all the branches of human knowledge. The Académie de Marine, founded in 1752, was reorganized. The Académie's first director, a post captain named Bigot de Morogue, wrote an elaborate treatise on naval tactics, the first original work on the subject since Paul Host's, which it was designed to supersede. Morogues must have been studying and formulating his problems in tactics in days when France had no fleet, and was unable so much as to raise her head at sea under the blows of her enemy. At the same time England had no similar book, and an English lieutenant in 1762 was just translating a part of Host's great work, omitting by far the larger part. It was not until nearly 20 years later that Clarke, a Scotch private gentleman, published an ingenious study of naval tactics, in which he pointed out to English admirals the system by which the French had thwarted their thoughtless and ill-combined attacks. The researches of the Académie de Marine and the energetic impulse which it gave to the labors of officers were not, as we hope to show later, without influence upon the relatively prosperous condition in which the Navy was at the beginning of the American War. It has already been pointed out that the American War of Independence involved a departure from England's traditional and true policy by committing her to a distant land war, while powerful enemies were waiting for an opportunity to attack her at sea. Like France in the then recent German wars, like Napoleon later in the Spanish War, England, through undue self-confidence, was about to turn a friend into an enemy, and so expose the real basis of her power to a rude proof. The French government, on the other hand, avoided the snare into which it had so often fallen. Turning her back on the European continent, having the probability of neutrality there, and the certainty of alliance with Spain by her side, France advanced to the contest with a fine navy and a brilliant, though perhaps relatively inexperienced, body of officers. On the other side of the Atlantic she had the support of a friendly people, and of her own or allied ports, both in the West Indies and on the continent. The wisdom of this policy, the happy influence of this action of the government upon her sea power, is evident; but the details of the war do not belong to this part of the subject. To Americans the chief interest of that war is found upon the land, but to naval officers upon the sea, for it was essentially a sea war. The intelligent and systematic efforts of 20 years bore their due fruit; for though the warfare afloat ended with a great disaster, the combined efforts of the French and Spanish fleets undoubtedly bore down England's strength and robbed her of her colonies. In the various naval undertakings and battles the honor of France was upon the whole maintained; though it is difficult, upon consideration of the general subject, to avoid the conclusion that the inexperience of French seamen as compared with English, the narrow spirit of jealousy shown by the noble corps of officers toward those of different antecedents, and above all the miserable traditions of 3/4 of a century already alluded to, the miserable policy of a government which taught them first to save their ships, to economize the material, prevented French admirals from reaping not the mere glory, but the positive advantages that more than once were within their grasp. When Monk said the nation that would rule upon the sea must always attack, he set the keynote to England's naval policy; and had the instructions of the French government consistently breathed the same spirit, the war of 1778 might have ended sooner and better than it did. It seems ungracious to criticize the conduct of a service to which, under God, our nation owes that its birth was not a miscarriage, but writers of its own country abundantly reflect the spirit of the remark. A French officer who served afloat during this war, in a work of calm and judicial tone, says: "What must the young officers have thought who were at Sandy Hook with D'Estaing, at St. Christopher with De Grasse, even those who arrived at Rhode Island with De Ternay, when they saw that these officers were not tried at their return?" Again, another French officer of much later date justifies the opinion expressed when speaking of the War of the American Revolution in the following terms: "It was necessary to get rid of the unhappy prejudices of the days of the Regency and of Louis XV. But the mishaps of which they were full were too recent to be forgotten by our ministers. Thanks to a wretched hesitation, fleets which had rightly alarmed England became reduced to ordinary proportions. Entrenching themselves in a false economy, the ministry claimed that, by reason of the excessive expenses necessary to maintain the fleet, the admirals must be ordered to maintain the greatest circumspection, as though in war half measures have not always led to disasters. So, too, the orders given to our squadron chiefs were to keep the sea as long as possible, without engaging in actions which might cause the loss of vessels difficult to replace. so that more than once complete victories, which would have crowned the skill of our admirals and the courage of our captains, were changed into successes of little importance. A system which laid down as a principle that an admiral should not use the force in his hands, which sent him against the enemy with the foreordained purpose of receiving rather than making the attack, a system which sapped moral power to save material resources, must have unhappy results. It is certain that this deplorable system was one of the causes of the lack of discipline and startling defections which marked the periods of Louis XVI., of the First Republic, and of the First Empire. Within 10 years of the peace of 1783 came the French Revolution, but that great upheaval which shook the foundations of states, loosed the ties of social order, and drove out of the navy nearly all the trained officers of the monarchy who were attached to the old state of things, did not free the French navy from a false system. It was easier to overturn the form of government than to uproot a deep-seated tradition. Here again a third French officer of the highest rank and literary accomplishments, speaking of the inaction of Villeneuve, the admiral who commanded the French rear at the battle of the Nile, and who did not leave his anchors while the head of the column was being destroyed. A day was to come, Trafalgar, in which Villeneuve, in his turn, like De Grasse before him, and like Duchâtel, would complain of being abandoned by part of his fleet. We have come to suspect some secret reason for this fatal coincidence. It is not natural that among so many honorable men there should so often be found admirals and captains incurring such a reproach. If the name of some of them is to this very day sadly associated with the memory of our disasters, we may be sure the fault is not wholly their own. We must rather blame the nature of the operations in which they were engaged, and that system of defensive war prescribed by the French government, which Pitt in the English Parliament proclaimed to be the forerunner of certain ruin. That system, when we wished to renounce it, had already penetrated our habits. It had, so to say, weakened our arms and paralyzed our self-reliance. Too often did our squadrons leave port with a special mission to fulfill, and with the intention of avoiding the enemy. To fall in with him was at once a piece of bad luck. It was thus that our ships went into action. They submitted to it instead of forcing it. Fortune would have hesitated longer between the two fleets, and not have borne in the end so heavily against ours, if Brueys, meeting Nelson half-way, could have gone out to fight him. This fettered and timid war, which Villaret and Martin had carried on, had lasted long, thanks to the circumspection of some English admirals and the traditions of the old tactics. It was with these traditions that the battle of the Nile had broken. The hour for decisive action had come. Some years later came Trafalgar, and again the government of France took up a new policy with the navy. The author last quoted speaks again. The emperor, whose eagle glance traced plans of campaign for his fleets as for his armies, was wearied by these unexpected reverses. He turned his eyes from the one field of battle in which fortune was faithless to him, and decided to pursue England elsewhere than upon the seas. He undertook to rebuild his navy, but without giving it any part in the struggle, which became more furious than ever. Nevertheless, far from slackening, the activity of our dockyards redoubled. Every year ships of the line were either laid down or added to the fleet. Venice and Genoa, under his control, saw their old splendors rise again, and from the shores of the Elbe to the head of the Adriatic, all the ports of the continent emulously seconded the creative thought of the emperor. Numerous squadrons were assembled in the Scheldt, in Brest Roads, and in Toulon, but to the end the emperor refused to give this navy, full of ardor and self-reliance, an opportunity to measure its strength with the enemy. Cast down by constant reverses, he had kept up our armed ships only to oblige our enemies to blockades whose enormous cost must end by exhausting their finances. When the empire fell, France had 103 ships of the line and 55 frigates. To turn now from the particular lessons drawn from the history of the past to the general question of the influence of government upon the sea career of its people, it is seen that that influence can work in two distinct but closely related ways. First, in peace. The government, by its policy, can favor the natural growth of a people's industries and its tendencies to seek adventure and gain by way of the sea, or it can try to develop such industries and such sea-going bent when they do not naturally exist. Or, on the other hand, the government may by mistaken action check and fetter the progress which the people left to themselves would make. In any one of these ways the influence of the government will be felt, making or marring the sea power of the country in the matter of peaceful commerce, upon which alone, it cannot be too often insisted, a thoroughly strong navy can be based. Secondly, for war. The influence of the government will be felt in its most legitimate manner in maintaining an armed navy, of a size commensurate with the growth of its shipping and the importance of the interests connected with it. More important even than the size of the navy is the question of its institutions favoring a healthful spirit and activity, and providing for rapid development in time of war by an adequate reserve of men and of ships, and by measures for drawing out that general reserve power which has before been pointed to when considering the character and pursuits of the people. Undoubtedly, under this second head of warlike preparation must come the maintenance of suitable naval stations in those distant parts of the world to which the armed shipping must follow the peaceful vessels of commerce. The protection of such stations must depend either upon direct military force, as do Gibraltar and Malta, or upon a surrounding friendly population, such as the American colonists once were to England, and it may be presumed the Australian colonists now are. Such friendly surroundings and backing, joined to a reasonable military provision, are the best of defences, and when combined with decided preponderance at sea, make a scattered and extensive empire like that of England secure. For while it is true that an unexpected attack may cause disaster in some one quarter, the actual superiority of naval power prevents such disaster from being general or irremediable. History has sufficiently proved this. England's naval bases have been in all parts of the world, and her fleets have at once protected them, kept open the communications between them, and relied upon them for shelter. Colonies attached to the mother country afford, therefore, the surest means of supporting abroad the sea power of a country. In peace, the influence of the government should be felt in promoting by all means a warmth of attachment and a unity of interest which will make the welfare of one the welfare of all, and the quarrel of one the quarrel of all; and in war, or rather for war, by inducing such measures of organization and defence as shall be felt by all to be a fair distribution of a burden of which each reaps the benefit. Such colonies the United States has not, and is not likely to have. As regards purely military naval stations, the feeling of her people was probably accurately expressed by an historian of the English navy 100 years ago, speaking then of Gibraltar and Port Mahon. Military governments, said he, agree so little with the industry of a trading people, and are in themselves so repugnant to the genius of the British people, that I do not wonder that men of good sense and of all parties have inclined to give up these as Tangiers was given up. Having therefore no foreign establishments, either colonial or military, the ships of war of the United States in war will be like land birds, unable to fly far from their own shores. To provide resting places for them, where they can coal and repair, would be one of the first duties of a government proposing to itself the development of the power of the nation at sea. As the practical object of this inquiry is to draw from the lessons of history inferences applicable to one's own country and service, it is proper now to ask how far the conditions of the United States involve serious danger, and call for action on the part of the government in order to build again her sea power. It will not be too much to say that the action of the government since the Civil War and up to this day has been effectively directed solely to what has been called the first link in the chain which makes sea power. Internal development, great production, with the accompanying aim and boast of self-sufficingness, such has been the object, such to some extent the result. In this the government has faithfully reflected the bent of the controlling elements of the country, though it is not always easy to feel that such controlling elements are truly representative, even in a free country. However that may be, there is no doubt that, besides having no colonies, the intermediate link of a peaceful shipping and the interests involved in it are now likewise lacking. In short, the United States has only one link of the three. The circumstances of naval war have changed so much within the last 100 years that it may be doubted whether such disastrous effects on the one hand, or such brilliant prosperity on the other, as were seen in the wars between England and France, could now recur. In her secure and haughty sway of the seas, England imposed a yoke on neutrals which will never again be borne, and the principle that the flag covers the goods is forever secured. The commerce of a belligerent can therefore now be safely carried on in neutral ships, except when contraband of war or to blockaded ports. And as regards the latter, it is also certain that there will be no more paper blockades. Putting aside, therefore, the question of defending her seaports from capture or contribution, as to which there is practical unanimity in theory and entire indifference in practice, what need has the United States of sea power? Her commerce is even now carried on by others. Why should her people desire that which, if possessed, must be defended at great cost? So far as this question is economical, it is outside the scope of this work; but conditions which may entail suffering and loss on the country by war are directly pertinent to it. Granting, therefore, that the foreign trade of the United States, going and coming, is on board ships which an enemy cannot touch except when bound to a blockaded port, what will constitute an efficient blockade? The present definition is that it is such as to constitute a manifest danger to a vessel seeking to enter or leave the port. This is evidently very elastic. Many can remember that during the Civil War, after a night attack on the United States fleet off Charleston, the Confederates next morning sent out a steamer with some foreign consuls on board, who so far satisfied themselves that no blockading vessel was in sight that they issued a declaration to that effect. On the strength of this declaration, some Southern authorities claimed that the blockade was technically broken, and could not be technically reestablished without a new notification. Is it necessary to constitute a real danger to blockade runners that the blockading fleet should be in sight? Half a dozen fast steamers cruising 20 miles offshore between the New Jersey and Long Island coast would be a very real danger to ships seeking to go in or out by the principal entrance to New York, and similar positions might effectively blockade Boston, the Delaware, and the Chesapeake. The main body of the blockading fleet, prepared not only to capture merchant ships but to resist military attempts to break the blockade, need not be within sight nor in a position known to the shore. The bulk of Nelson's fleet was 50 miles from Cadiz 2 days before Trafalgar, with a small detachment watching close to the harbor. The allied fleet began to get under way at 7 A.M., and Nelson, even under the conditions of those days, knew it by 9:30. The English fleet at that distance was a very real danger to its enemy. It seems possible, in these days of submarine telegraphs, that the blockading forces inshore and offshore, and from one port to another, might be in telegraphic communication with one another along the whole coast of the United States, readily giving mutual support; and if, by some fortunate military combination, one detachment were attacked in force, it could warn the others and retreat upon them. Granting that such a blockade off one port were broken on one day, by fairly driving away the ships maintaining it, the notification of its being reestablished could be cabled all over the world the next. To avoid such blockades there must be a military force afloat. that will at all times so endanger a blockading fleet that it can by no means keep its place. Then neutral ships, except those laden with contraband of war, can come and go freely, and maintain the commercial relations of the country with the world outside. It may be urged that, with the extensive sea coast of the United States, a blockade of the whole line cannot be effectively kept up. No one will more readily concede this than officers who remember how the blockade of the southern coast alone was maintained. But in the present condition of the navy, and it may be added with any additions not exceeding those so far proposed by the government, the attempt to blockade Boston, New York, the Delaware, the Chesapeake, and the Mississippi, in other words, the great centers of export and import, would not entail upon one of the large maritime nations efforts greater than have been made before. England has at the same time blockaded Brest, the Biscay coast, Toulon, and Cadiz, when there were powerful squadrons lying within the harbors. It is true that commerce in neutral ships can then enter other ports of the United States than those named; but what a dislocation of the carrying traffic of the country, what failure of supplies at times, what inadequate means of transport by rail or water, of dockage, of lighterage, of warehousing, will be involved in such an enforced change of the ports of entry? Will there be no money loss, no suffering consequent upon this? And when, with much pain and expense, these evils have been partially remedied, the enemy may be led to stop the new inlets as he did the old. The people of the United States will certainly not starve, but they may suffer grievously. As for supplies, which are contraband of war, is there not reason to fear that the United States is not now able to go alone if an emergency should arise? The question is eminently one in which the influence of the government should make itself felt, to build up for the nation a navy which, if not capable of reaching distant countries, shall at least be able to keep clear the chief approaches to its own. The eyes of the country have for a quarter of a century been turned from the sea. The results of such a policy and of its opposite will be shown in the instance of France and of England. Without asserting a narrow parallelism between the case of the United States and either of these, it may safely be said that it is essential to the welfare of the whole country that the conditions of trade and commerce should remain, as far as possible, unaffected by an external war. In order to do this, the enemy must be kept not only out of our ports, but far away from our coasts. Can this navy be had without restoring the merchant shipping? It is doubtful. History has proved that such a purely military sea power can be built up by a despot, as was done by Louis XIV. But though so fair seeming, experience showed that his navy was like a growth which, having no root, soon withers away. But in a representative government, any military expenditure must have a strongly represented interest behind it, convinced of its necessity. Such an interest in sea power does not exist, cannot exist here without action by the government. How such a merchant shipping should be built up, whether by subsidies or by free trade, by constant administration of tonics or by free movement in the open air, is not a military but an economical question. Even had the United States a great national shipping, it may be doubted whether a sufficient navy would follow. The distance which separates her from other great powers, in one way a protection, is also a snare. The motive, if any there be, which will give the United States a navy, is probably now quickening in the Central American Isthmus. Let us hope it will not come to the birth too late. Here concludes the general discussion of the principal elements which affect favorably or unfavorably the growth of sea power in nations. The aim has been first to consider those elements in their natural tendency for or against, and then to illustrate by particular examples and by the experience of the past. Such discussions, while undoubtedly embracing a wider field, yet fall mainly within the province of strategy, as distinguished from tactics. The considerations and principles which enter into them belong to the unchangeable or unchanging order of things, remaining the same in cause and effect from age to age. They belong, as it were, to the order of nature, of whose stability so much is heard in our day. Whereas tactics, using as its instruments the weapons made by man, shares in the change and progress of the race from generation to generation. From time to time the superstructure of tactics has to be altered or wholly torn down, but the old foundations of strategy so far remain, as though laid upon a rock. There will next be examined the general history of Europe and America, with particular reference to the effect exercised upon that history and upon the welfare of the people by sea power in its broad sense. From time to time, as occasion offers, the aim will be to recall and reinforce the general teaching already elicited by particular illustrations. The general tenor of the study will therefore be strategical, in that broad definition of naval strategy which has before been quoted and accepted. Naval strategy has for its end to found, support, and increase, as well in peace as in war, the sea power of a country. In the matter of particular battles, while freely admitting that the change of details has made obsolete much of their teaching, the attempt will be made to point out where the application or neglect of true general principles has produced decisive effects; and other things being equal, those actions will be preferred which, from their association with the names of the most distinguished officers, may be presumed to show how far just tactical ideas obtained in a particular age or a particular service. It will also be desirable, where analogies between ancient and modern weapons appear on the surface, to derive such probable lessons as they offer, without laying undue stress upon the points of resemblance. Finally, it must be remembered that among all changes the nature of man remains much the same. The personal equation, though uncertain in quantity and quality in the particular instance, is sure always to be found. End of Chapter 1, Part 4.